If you've ever wondered how to add waist shaping to a top-down sweater, we are going through the whole process in this video. But I do want to warn you, there is a little bit of math, but I promise it's not hard and we're going to walk through it step by step. And believe me, if I can do this math, then you can too. So let's go talk about adding waist shaping to our top-down sweaters. And thanks to Craftsy for sponsoring this video. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and I believe knitting is a form of self-care. You can take time for yourself and the creative things that you love to do, like your knitting, and also create beautiful garments that you love to wear. I know that feels like a tall order sometimes, but I promise that you can do that. You can customize your knitting patterns to get a fit that you want. And one of the ways we can easily customize a sweater is by adding some waist shaping or hip shaping or A-line shaping or hourglass shaping, whatever kind of shaping you want along the body of your sweater. We're going to cover that today, the whole topic, and how it breaks down and how to work out the math. And the math is not hard. You just need to know some measurements, and then we have to convert those to your stitch and row gauge. And I'm going to walk you through with some examples. And then you can apply that to your next sweater. So I have my iPad here and it is screen recording, and we are going to walk through this process, and I'm going to take some notes and show them to you on the screen. Now the first step is to decide on the actual shape that you want. Like I said in the beginning, a lot of the sweaters today are one size from the underarm to the hem. There is no extra shaping, it's one circumference, like all the way around. A boxy shape, just one size. But you can have other shapes as well that you can use by working some increases or some decreases. A common one would be A-line shaping. So you have one size at the bust and you gradually increase that so it's wider at the hem, kind of creates an A shape. The opposite of that would be tapered shaping, where you are larger at the chest or the bust and it gets smaller at the hem. Now this one is pretty standard in maybe men's patterns, not all patterns. A lot of them are going to have that boxy straight fit like other sweaters, but you will, if you see this one, it's probably going to be in men's sweaters. Like it's one size at the chest and then it slowly decreases to taper it in at the waist. And then the third option is to have hourglass shaping. So you're one size at the bust, you come in at the waist and you go back out at the hem. So that's a pretty exaggerated picture of what I'm talking about right there. But you're one size, you bring it in a little at the waist, you go back out at the hemline. So that's pretty standard for a lot of women's tops. And especially if you see like a button-down top that has like some internal princess seams or something like that, where you get this hourglass shape. And that is also one of the methods that we can incorporate into our sweaters. So you have straight shaping, you have A-line shaping, tapered shaping, and hourglass shaping. So that's the first thing. Pick the shaping that you want for your sweater. The next step is to figure out where you want to place this shaping. So if it's A-line shaping, you're probably going to start that either like after you divide the sleeves and the body, or right around the high point of your bust, and slowly increase along the sides. Reverse that for a tapered fit, where you're that same area somewhere between the bust and the underarm, you will start slowly decreasing down to the hem. For hourglass shaping, you have to think about where do you want that part to nip in the most. And it's going to be different for every body. If you have a short torso, if you have a long torso, if you want to use your natural waist, if you want to use a different spot. To find your natural waist, the easiest thing to do is kind of bend sideways and go look in a mirror. That point where the bend occurs, that's probably your natural waist. Now, mine's kind of low. I have a long torso. I don't actually want my waist shaping there. There's a point on my body where I'm narrower, just below my bust. I actually like to put my waist shaping there. It's not my actual natural waist, but it's the narrowest part of my body along my torso. So I want my waist shaping there a lot of the time. But it's totally up to you. You can decide when it comes to hourglass shaping, where do you want that waist shaping to happen? Where do you want that smallest curve to land on your body? That's what you have to decide. Now, before we get to the measurements and the math, just a quick shout out to Craftsy. I use their classes a lot. They have some great classes on sweater fit and modifications and spinning. So let's talk about that. One of my favorite resources for online creative learning is Craftsy. They have more than 2,000 classes with a huge variety of hobbies. I couldn't even begin to list them all if I tried. If you have a hobby, Craftsy most likely has a class or two for that hobby, including knitting, sewing, quilting, crochet, painting and drawing, cooking, baking, and cake decorating. It's one of my go-to resources when I'm learning a new skill, whether that's knitting related or even fiber adjacent. I just got a spinning wheel for Christmas and I have been learning everything I possibly can about it with the help of some great Craftsy classes. If you're brand new to spinning, I highly recommend Amy King's Foundations of Spinning. It's a really great course and I rewatched so many of those videos as I was learning how to use my spinning wheel. It's the perfect introduction to spinning. It covers everything from the parts of a spinning wheel, the different types of fibers and fiber preps that you can spin, some fun wheel games that she uses to get you used to using your spinning wheel. Believe me, those wheel games are the best. If you go through those, then you will get used to using your spinning wheel, and before you know it, you'll actually be spinning. If you're ready to explore a new hobby like spinning or improve another hobby like your knitting, then you need to check out Craftsy. There are so many great classes that you can use to improve or learn new skills. And if you want a great discount, be sure to check the link below this video. The first 1,000 subscribers to click and use that link can get a full year's premium membership for just $1.49. That's a huge savings compared to their usual $123 a year. So click that link down in the video description box and start your next hobby adventure with Craftsy. So now we're on to step 3. We know the shape that we want the body of our sweater to have. We know the measurements that we're going to need, especially if it's hourglass shaping. Now we need to think about some measurements. So you need a tape measure for this step. Now, for one part of it, the rest of it, you have to look at the pattern itself to get the measurements there. The first measurement you need is the circumference at the bust, or where you divide the sleeves and body, somewhere in that area. Divide the sleeves and body for A-line and tapered, at the bust for an hourglass. Somewhere around there. You just need to know the sweater circumference in inches or centimeters at that point. Then you also need to know the sweater circumference that you want at the hem. Is it the same size? Are you going to be changing things so you're going to have a different circumference? This is where you can decide. Measure your body at the point where the hem of that sweater is going to land and add the ease that you want, like maybe a couple of inches or more, depending on the type of sweater that you're knitting. You just need to know the circumference that you're going to end with. So those are our two circumferences. We know where we are at the bust, according to the sweater most likely, and then we need to know where it's going to be at the hem. Might be the same as the sweater, it might be something different because you're changing it with this waist shaping. Okay, so we know the two circumferences. The next step is the length. Now for A-line or tapered, you just need to know from either the underarm or from the full bust, wherever you're going to start that shaping, down to the hem. What's that length? How long is that sweater going to be from that point? So get that measurement. For hourglass shaping, we have to divide this into two areas. What's the distance from the under bust? Because that's where you're probably going to start your waist shaping for hourglass shaping. The point of like underneath your bust to the point where you want the smallest part of that waist circumference to be. What's the length in that area? And then leave about an inch to work straight for like the main part of the waist. And then from that waist point down to the hem of the sweater, how much length do you have there? It could be the same, could be different, because I like mine a little bit higher. I have a pretty short section I can work between my underbust and the waist. And then after the waist shaping is done, I work an inch. And then it's probably double between the waist and where I like the hem to fall. But again, that depends on the actual sweater that you're knitting and where you want the smallest part of the waist shaping to be. So for hourglass shaping, you've got to divide this up into two sections. You just need to know those lengths, and they should total up into the total length that you want for your sweater. So the length from the underbust to the smallest point of the waist, and then leave about an inch from there. And then from the bottom of that waist shaping down to the hem. You need to know that part. Now that we have your measurements, it's time for the math. Yes, we've got to do our calculations here, but we're going to walk through it step by step. We're going to turn those measurements into stitch and row or round counts, depending on whether you're knitting flat or in the round, and using those numbers to figure out your shaping rate, depending on the sweater that you're knitting. So let's go through this process. The first thing you need to know is your 1-inch stitch and row or round gauge. So to determine this, let's say you are knitting a pattern and it is 20 stitches in 4 inches. So we simply divide 20 stitches by 4 to figure out how many stitches we should have in 1 inch, and that would be 5. we would have 5 stitches to the inch. Now, if your gauge is different or it's a different pattern or whatever, you just figure out your 1-inch stitch gauge. If you know your gauge in 4 inches, you're just going to divide that stitch count by 4 to figure out what it is in 1 inch. Now, once you have this 1-inch stitch gauge number, we use this with those circumference measurements. So you have 2 circumference measurements, the circumference you want at the top of the body of your sweater, whether that's the full bust, at the underarm, wherever that is, somewhere in that area. And then the circumference that you want at the waist, if you're doing hourglass shaping, and the circumference that you want at the hem. So you're going to take your 1-inch stitch gauge and multiply it by each of those numbers to find out how many stitches you want in each of those locations. So let's say you're using a pattern and the circumference of the sweater is 40 inches at the bust. You're going to multiply 40 times 5, and that gives you 200. So the body of your sweater will be 200 stitches at the bust. Then you're going to do the same for the waist if you're doing hourglass shaping. Remember to keep a little bit of ease there. You want at least 2 to 4 inches of ease at the waist, even if you're nipping it in for hourglass shaping, just so it doesn't feel like it's clinging to your body. And then you're going to repeat this at the hem as well. So you know your target stitch counts. For A-line shaping, you're going to want that at the upper part of your sweater around the bust or at the underarm. And then at the hem, tapered shaping, same thing. Hourglass shaping, you've got the waist in the middle. So you need to know your stitch counts in those different locations. And you're going to take the desired circumference that you want, multiply it by your 1-inch stitch gauge, and that will tell you how many stitches you should have in each of those areas. Now you're going to do the same process, but for your length. So the rows or the rounds in your gauge, whether that's 4 inches or whatever, you need to figure out what it is, rows or rounds to the inch. And then look at the desired length of your sweater for the body of that sweater, multiply it by your 1-inch row or round gauge to figure out how many rows or rounds you have along that length. So for A-line and tapered, it's the whole length from the underarm or the point of the full bust all the way to the hem. You want to multiply that length that you want by your 1-inch row or round gauge. For hourglass shaping, you've got to divide it up again. So from the underbust to the waist, that measurement, that length multiplied by your row or round gauge to the inch. Leave an inch plain at the waist. And then whatever that length is below the waist down to the hem of the sweater, multiply that by your row or round gauge. So you're going to have 2 different measurements plus that extra inch in the middle. It's one more step past the A-line and the tapered, but it's worth it in the end for a good hourglass shaping. Now that you have your stitch numbers and your row numbers, we can use these to calculate our shaping rate. That means how often are we going to decrease or increase? If you're working A-line shaping, let's say you want to get from like 30 inch at the top of your sweater and you want it to be 50 inches at the bottom. You have to add 20 inches of shaping. That's a lot, probably too much. So you need to know how many stitches you're going to increase along the sides and how often to do them, because you don't want to cram them all up at the beginning, because that's going to make a really weird shape. It'll go bulge out and then it'll just kind of drop off. A-line shaping, you want to be like a nice smooth A-line shape. Tapered, same, you're just going in the opposite direction. So you need to figure out the shaping rate to get you that nice smooth increase or decrease line without having all of your increases or decreases bunched all up in one place. So the first step is to figure out the difference in stitch count. So for A-line shaping, you're starting out with a smaller circumference, moving to a larger circumference at the hem. And you already have that stitch count. So what you're going to do is subtract the bust circumference from the hem circumference. This is going to give you a stitch count. And this is how many stitches you know you want to increase along the sides to get to that larger hem. Tapered shaping, the opposite. You are at a larger stitch count. You want to narrow it down. So you're going to do the same thing. You're going to subtract that smaller number from the larger. That's the number of stitches you want to decrease along the sides to get that tapered fit. Hourglass shaping is a combination of the two. You're tapering from the bust to the waist, and then you're doing A-line shaping. You're going in the opposite direction. You're going back out from the waist to the hips. So we have to do this in 2 steps. So for we take the bust measurement circumference in stitches that we want, and then we subtract the waist circumference stitches that we want, and that tells us how many stitches we're going to decrease away at the waist. And then we have to move from that stitch count back out to the stitch count we want at the hem. So we subtract it again we subtract the waist stitch counts from the hem stitch count, and that tells us how many stitches we have to increase from the waist to the hem. That's a lot of math, I know, but I'm gonna do an example right now. So let's say we want a sweater that is 30 inches at the bust and 28 at the hips or the waist, and then 32 at the hips. And if we convert this by our 1-inch stitch gauge of 5 stitches, we know that is 150 stitches here, 140 stitches here, and 160 stitches here. So working from our bust to our waist, we're going to have to decrease so subtract 140 from 150, we're going to decrease by 10 stitches. And then we have to move from our waist to our hips. And again, we've got 20 stitches here, but we are increasing at this point. So this is what we're doing. We're going to decrease from our bust or under bust to the waist by 10 stitches, and then work about an inch even at the waist. And then between the waist and the hem of the sweater, we have to increase 20 stitches. Once you know how many stitches you are increasing or decreasing, you have to decide how many increase or decrease rounds you have to work. So let's say you know you want to work A-line shaping at the seams. That might be 2 stitches, 1 on each side, or it could be 4, 2 on each side. For tapered shaping, it could be the same. You could work 1 on each side, you could work 2 on each side with sort of like a side seam stitch in the middle. Hourglass shaping, you can work them on the sides. You can do internal darts and have like a stitch on either side of a marker there. You have to decide how many stitches you're going to decrease on a decrease round. So let's just keep it simple. Let's say you just want to decrease or increase by 2 stitches. So in my example, I was decreasing 10 stitches from the bust to the waist. If I'm decreasing 2 stitches on each decrease round, then I'm going to take 10, divide it by 2, that gives me 5. So I have 5 decrease rounds that I have to work to remove those 2 stitches. Now, if you have a lot of stitches, then you're probably going to want to do either 4 or 6. You might want to work a lot more increases or decreases to get to that number. But if it's a gradual shaping like A-line or tapering, then 2 to 4 stitches is probably plenty. So you're just going to take the number of stitches you want to increase or decrease and use that number as the divisor. So the number of stitches you have to decrease, my case it was 10, and if I want to decrease by 2 stitches on a decrease round, I'm going to divide that by 2, and that tells me I have 5 decrease rounds to work to get rid of all of those 10 stitches. Does that make sense? So that's what you have to decide for your sweater, how many decreases or increases you want to work on each of those rounds. If you have a lot of stitches, then it might be maybe you're going to do 4. So then I would take that 10 and I can't really divide it by 4. I'd probably have 1 round where I just do 2 and then a couple of rounds where I'm doing the 4 decreases. This works good if you have a lot of stitches to either decrease or increase, especially with hourglass shaping. You have smaller areas to work that shaping, then you might want to do 4 or 6 increases or decreases depending on your shaping. So that's the thing you have to figure out next is how many decrease rounds you have to work. So in my case, I'm going to have 10 stitches to decrease. I'm going to do 2, so that is 5 decrease rounds. And then when I increase, I'm increasing by 20 stitches, and I'm going to do the same, probably 2 increases on an increase round. So 20 divided by 2 is 10. So I'm going to have to increase 10 times 2 stitches per increase round to get that goal number that I want. Okay, that's the first step in the process. Now the next thing to do is to figure out how many rows or rounds you have to actually do this shaping. So first you need to remove the edging, whatever's happening at the bottom, like if you're doing a couple inches of rib or whatever kind of edging hem you have at the bottom of your sweater, subtract that from that total length that you've already determined. because we don't want to do any shaping in that part. We want that all to happen in the body of the sweater minus the hem. So whatever that length of the sweater is, subtract the hem. That gives you the number of rows or rounds you can actually do this shaping over. So for A-line, that could be anywhere between the underarm or the bust all the way down to the hem, minusing out, subtracting out the edging. Tapered, the same, somewhere between the underarm and the full bust. You're going to start tapering down to the hem, but you want subtract out the ribbing or whatever you have at the bottom, so you just know the length of the actual body of the sweater. Same for the hourglass, but then we have to divide that. We have to divide that up. So from under bust to the waist point that we want for our sweater shaping, that's part one. I'm going to go with 3 inches. I'm just pulling some numbers out. We're going to go with 3 inches. Then we have to work an inch straight, and then from that bottom of the waist to the hem, subtracting out like the hem edging, let's say it's 5 inches. That's what we're going to go with for ours. So that's the next step, is you need to know how many inches you have. We need to convert that to rows or rounds. So let's do that now. So I know between my under bust and where I want the waist shaping to fall, that's 3 inches. So I can multiply that by my row or round gauge, and that gives me 21 rows or rounds. Then I know I have to work an inch straight between where that waist shaping is going to be. That's basically because we don't want the decreasing and then the increasing to sort of like get all squished up together. We want to give them a little space in between, give that sweater a little bit of breathing room. So about an inch in between. And then I know I have 5 inches between the bottom of that, or after that 1 inch, and before the hem edging, I have 5 inches. So if I multiply 5 inches times my 7 rows per inch, then I know that I have 35 rounds in that area that I can work. So now we have our numbers. We know the stitches we need to decrease. We know the number of rounds that we have to work those decreases. That's most of it. Now we just have to do one quick calculation. Okay, so now that we've done all of the numbers, we've gotten the numbers we need, we have one simple calculation to do. We know how many decrease or increase rounds we want to work, and we know how many rows or rounds we have to work them over. So we need to like scatter them throughout that row or round section so they are evenly distributed. So all we need to do is take the number of rows or rounds in that length area that we have to work with, divide it by the number of increase or decrease rounds we have to work. And that will give us a shaping rate. It most likely is going to work out to some random number with lots of numbers, decimal points after. And there's a few ways we can play with that. So in my example, from my bust, my under bust to my waist, I had 3 inches, which translated to 21 rows or rounds. And I know I wanted 5 decrease rounds. And I know right away from looking at this, 21 cannot be divided by 5. Let me do my quick math here and I'll actually see what it's going to be. So 4.2, so it's telling me every 4.2 rounds, I need to do my 2-stitch decrease round. Of course, I can't do that 4.2. I could round it down to 4. That would work just fine. In this instance, that would be fine. What I think I would do though is I know that 20, which is 1 row less, is divisible by 5, and it would be 4. So 20 rounds or rows between the under bust to the waist divided by 5 would be 4. So every 4 rounds, I'm going to decrease 2 stitches. And that leaves me an extra round, which is fine. I can stick that with the waist, the work even area. I have an inch I have to work right there. So that would be fine. I could put that there. So what that means, that translates to how often I'm going to decrease. So I'm at the point of my under bust. I'm going to work my first decrease round, and then I'm going to knit 3 rounds. And then I'm going to do my decrease round again, and then I'm going to knit 3 rounds. So that's what this calculation is telling us. It's telling us how often do we have to do that shaping. And in my case, I'm decreasing. So I have to decrease every 4 rows or rounds because, again, I have 21 rows or rounds. I moved it down to 20 just to make the math easy. Divide that by 5, that gives me 4. So decrease, work 3 rounds. Decrease, work 3 rounds, and that's my every 4 rounds I am doing that decrease shaping. Now if you end up with a number that has lots of decimal numbers after the decimal point and you just can't You can just go with the number that's at the beginning and it'll probably be fine. You'll just have a little extra at the bottom that you didn't really need. It'll just be above the hem. It's okay. It's knitting. It's not going to look terrible. Or you could, like I just did with my example of the 21, I know that 20 is divisible by 5, so I just take out that one row or round and I would move that to the center with the waist shaping. So you could do that as well. You could look for a number that's close to that target number of rows or rounds you have and is divisible by the number of increase or decrease rounds that you want to work. Okay, so I know from my under bust to the waist, I'm going to decrease 5 times every 4 rounds. And that's going to get me to above that 1 inch plus my extra round. And then I'll work straight at that area. And then we can do the next part. We have to go in the reverse. We want to increase by 10. I have 10 increase rounds. I want to increase 20 stitches and I'm going to increase 2 stitches on each round. So divide 2 by 20. That gives me 10 increase rounds. And I have 35 rows to work that over. 10 increase rounds. And just looking at it, I know that 35 is not divisible by 10. And with quick math, I know that gives me 3.5. So every 3.5 rounds, I should increase. I could actually split the difference with this one because it's a 0.5. I could go like every 3 rounds and then next time do it on the 4th round and then back to doing it on the 3rd round and then back to doing it on the 4th round, which you can definitely do. Or I could round this number, this 35 rows or rounds, because I know with working from the under bust to the waist, increase or decrease, work straight, decrease, work 3 rounds, decrease, work 3 rounds. I'm ending with that work 3 rounds plus that extra round I had. So that's 4 rounds. So that is maybe, it's like half an inch of what I need for my work even. So what if I took a few of these rounds and add it to that work even section and I reduced it to 30 rounds. Let's say I have 30 rounds instead of 35. So if I do that, then I know 30 divided by 10 is 3. So every 3 rounds, I would be increasing. Or if I wanted to make my sweater a little longer, I could reverse that and push it up to 40. And then I know every 4 rounds, I would be increasing. So you have some room to play, some wiggle room. It's knitting. Like your sweater, you can shift things around a little bit to make them fit. You can maybe shorten the edging at the hem to fit in the shaping. You could change your shaping rate. Maybe instead of 2, you want to do 4. Like if it's really difficult, like if you have to do some shaping every other round, that can get, you can start to end up with bulges. And I've done that. I did a sweater where I did this one actually. The first time I knit it, I did some shaping at the back and along the sides. But the sides, because it was so quick, it was every 2 rounds, I ended up with a weird bulge. So if you have so many stitches that you have to incorporate that you're having to do them every other round, add some other stitches along those increase rounds so you can slow it down. So instead of doing 2 stitches increasing every other round, do 4 stitches and then you can reduce that and do it every 4 rounds. And that sort of helps the fabric absorb all of those stitches that you're increasing by. So these are the calculations though. It's not that hard. You just need to know your measurements, convert those to stitch and row gauges, and then figure out your shaping rate, which you just need to know the number of your shaping rounds, whether that's decreasing or increasing, and then divide the number of rows or rounds you have to work that shaping by that number. And then you can fudge it a bit to make it work for your sweater. But we're still not done. We've done the hardest part though. Now that you know exactly how to get the waist shaping that you want for your sweater, where are you going to put it? For A-line and tapered, it's very common to just put them along the side seams. So if you're working top down, you're separating the body and the sleeves, you're casting on stitches at each underarm. Stick a marker right in the center of those cast on stitches so you have like a place that would be sort of the side seam of the sweater. And you're going to work your increases and decreases along those markers at the sides for A-line and for tapered shaping. For hourglass shaping, you can work them there, or you can work them internally. Like if you think of those button-up blouses that have, or dresses that have like those princess dart seams along the center of the top or the dress, then we can do that in knitting as well. They're called internal darts. So you have to decide which one you prefer, and it depends on how you're shaped, really. If your curves are more at the sides, put your shaping there. If your curves are more at the front and the back, like your bust and your belly and your bum, then put the shaping there. Personally, I like the internal shaping, but I only like it on the back. I don't want to accentuate my stomach. So I put it along the back and nip it in a little at the waist, and it really defines my back curve, and I really like that. Then I also add some A-line shaping sometimes to give me some extra increases from the waist to the hips to account for my bum and my hips. So you can combine these any way you want, but in general, if it's A-line or tapered, you're working them at the side seams. If it is hourglass shaping or hourglass and maybe A-line combined to give you a little extra room if you are working from like the waist to the hips and you've got more stitches to involve, which is, I generally do like between 4 and 6 increases on an increase round. I will do 1 on each side seam and then 2 on the back dart markers on each one. So that's another 4. And then I don't have to do them like every other round. I can space them out like every 4 rounds because I'm doing 6 increases all at once. So it's your sweater, and you can decide how you want that to work. So A-line or tapered at the sides, hourglass shaping, internal or at the sides. It depends on where you want the shaping to fall. I like the shaping to happen where my body is shaped, and you can combine the two. Now, for those vertical dart lines, it's best to place some markers, and then you can just work your increases at those markers. So along the side seams, like I said, you're going to place markers at the underarm. Now, for internal darts, I just follow Amy Herzog's formula in all of her books. She talks about this. I think it's online as well. For the internal darts, on the back, you're going to take the stitch count that is for the back, not the full circumference, just the stitches across the back, divide them into thirds. And you'll have 2 markers dividing those 3 sections. If it's not divisible by 3, then if it's an extra stitch, stick it in the middle. If it's 2 extra, stick them on the sides. It doesn't have to be super exact. You just want to divide that stitch count into thirds. Now, for the front of the sweater, we don't really want this because it puts them right at our bust point, which you might not want right there. You might not want them right at that point. So what we do instead is you take half that front stitch count and put that between 2 markers, and then you have a quarter of those stitches at each side. And then again, if it doesn't evenly divide, if it's an extra stitch, stick it in the middle. If it's 2 extra stitches, stick them at the sides. Like, just work it out so you have about half the stitch count in the front between those 2 markers, and then a quarter of the stitch count at each side. So when it comes to my sweaters, when I'm adding hourglass shaping, I tend to, from the underbust to the waist, work it just at the back. And then, because I'm usually trying to increase a lot of stitches from my waist out to my hips, because my hips are larger than my bust, then I'm doing more increases. I'm usually doing maybe 4 or 6. I'm working some at the side seams and then some at that internal dart marker at the back as well. So it's totally customizable depending on what you need for your sweater. We've done the hard work now. We have our markers placed. We know our shaping rate, how often we have to do our increase or decrease rounds, how many stitches we are increasing or decreasing on those decrease rounds. We are set. The last thing to do is actually work them. So I just want to walk you through quickly how I would do this shaping, just to give you an idea. And of course, if you find other ways you want to do it, then go ahead and use those. But this is like a basic guideline you can follow for your shaping. So let's start with A-line shaping. So I know it looks tapered, but imagine you are knitting from this point down to the hem. So this is why it's shaped this way. So, and we are increasing, we're going from 1 stitch count to another stitch count. So, and we want to work our increases at the side seam markers. So let's say right here, we're going to work a make one right, and then we're going to knit across, and then work a make one left. Maybe 1 stitch in. So let's say we knit 1, work a make one right, knit across to the last stitch, make 1 left, and knit 1. So that's if we wanted to do 2 stitches. If you want to do 4, then just turn your work and do the same thing on the other side of the sweater. But let's say you are doing a tapered sweater, so it's going to go this way. So we're knitting here and we want to decrease down to our hem. So let's do that. Knit one. And then I like to follow the slant we're going at here. So I would do an SSK on this side. And then we want to work until we get to our last 3 stitches, and we're going to work on knit 2 together and then knit 1. So that would be 2 stitches decreased. And of course, if we want to decrease 4 stitches, this is half the sweater. We get to that other side seam, we turn, and we do the whole process again on the other side. So that is A-line and tapered, increasing and decreasing at the side seams. And I'll have all of this like written out down below as well. At internal dart markers, I like to work it a little bit differently, and I've been playing around with this because like there's one standard method that works bottom up to give you that curve that you want for your darts. But when you're working top down, it kind of goes like this instead. I'll show you a picture of what I mean. So I've been playing around with where these should be placed to get that curve that goes this way. I hope that makes sense. Like I've just been looking at like shirts and things, and the curves generally come in like this, and that's what I wanted on my sweater top down. So when we place those markers, those internal markers, remember on the back you're dividing your stitch count into thirds, and on the front you're putting half the stitch count in the center and then a quarter at each side. So we have some markers placed. This is where these increases and decreases will be worked. Let me try to draw this out for you. So we're starting at our bust, working down to our waist, back out to our hips. So that's like the shape of the sweater, but our internal lines are going to run right here along the center of that sweater. So I like to put an SSK here and a knit 2 together here. So the tricky part here is, where is your beginning of round? Is it at the side? Is it like in the back neck for a yoke sweater? It's going to be different depending on the sweater you're doing, but when you have those markers placed, this is basically where you're going to put them. You have an SSK here and a knit 2 together here, and it kind of starts to take that shape. So I'll put the instructions down below, but it changes depending on where your beginning of round is. If your beginning of round is here, then you have to, knit to the marker, slip the marker, SSK, knit to 2 stitches before the marker, knit 2 together, slip the marker, and then repeat on the other side if you're doing it on both sides of your sweater. If your beginning of round is like here in the center of the back neck, then it's knit to 2 stitches before the marker, knit 2 together, knit all the way around to the other internal dart marker, and then do the SSK. So, but I figured this way you can see what it's supposed to look like. Basically, you want an SSK on this marker and a knit 2 together on this one, and they're on the inside, this section of your sweater. So the back third, the back center third, or the back or the front center half, whatever is in the middle right here. That's where you're putting those decreases. And then for increasing, I just did the opposite. So if I'm having a left slanting increase here and a right slanting increase here, I reversed that. So I was moving left here. So on this side, I'm going to go right. So make 1 right. On this side, it's make 1 left. So that, I ended up liking the way the curve worked on my back, on my sweater, for that shaping. Now there is another alternative way to do this shaping. It's generally done from the bottom up. So I will put that down below for you as well, in case this looks too confusing. But basically, yeah, if you're working top down, you are working a decrease that goes to the left on this side, and then a decrease that goes to the right on this side, and then you reverse it. So you are doing a left slanting decrease on that side and a right slanting decrease on that side. So if you're knitting a sweater bottom up, the whole process is exactly the same, except of course you're working from the hem to the bust or the underarm. You're still going to do the same exact math, it's just going in a different direction. The only other thing that could be different is the internal darts, like where you're placing, not where you're placing the markers, but how you're working your increases and decreases. And I've put those instructions down below. This, the one I just showed you, is my preferred way of working top down, by putting the increases and decrease inside that middle, the center portion of the front or the back. For working bottom up, I place them on the outsides, The center doesn't change. The increases and decreases are along those outside markers. Now, I know that is a lot of information to process and absorb, and come back and rewatch parts of this if you need to, so you can learn how to add this kind of shaping to your sweaters. It really is a game changer when you can start customizing your sweaters to fit you really well, like they should. If you're going to take the time to knit a whole sweater, you want it to fit you, of course, right? So there are more ways we could customize sweaters, and I have a whole playlist on this topic. I also have a whole workshop where I coach people on making these fit adjustments for their own sweaters. You'll find a link for the workshop down below, and if you want to check out that playlist, I'll put it right here, and you can look at other ways you can customize different parts of the sweater to fit you really well. And last of all, thanks to Craftsy for sponsoring this video.